Are Trump's tariffs a fair policy or an economic threat to Canada? Today, Canada is not facing a military invasion, but it is confronting a different kind of challenge, an economic strike. The United States, under Donald Trump's leadership, has introduced tariffs that pose a direct threat to Canada's economy. These tariffs are not just an inconvenience. They have the potential to disrupt key industries, interfere with established supply chains, and increase costs for consumers on both sides of the border. But are these tariffs truly a fair economic policy, or will they bring unintended consequences? For the very country that enforces them, Trump's decision to impose tariffs is rooted in his Make America Great Again ideology, a policy framework that prioritizes American industry and economic independence. The idea is to strengthen America by encouraging domestic production and reducing reliance on foreign imports. However, while Trump's supporters argue that tariffs will boost the US economy, their effects on global trade, and particularly on Canada, could be devastating. Canada is heavily reliant on the United States for trade, especially in critical sectors like oil, gas, steel, aluminum, and agriculture. Tariffs targeting these industries could result in higher prices for American consumers, while simultaneously threatening the stability of thousands of Canadian jobs. Trump's administration initially announced the tariffs, but later suspended them for 30 days. However, this suspension is indefinite, leaving Canada in a state of uncertainty as the US government continues to search for justifications to reimpose the measures. If these tariffs are implemented, Canadian industries and workers could face significant economic hardship. But Canada is not backing down. The Canadian government has signaled that it is not a nation willing to surrender under Trump's economic pressure. As the US becomes an increasingly unreliable trade partner, Canada is exploring new relationships, most notably with China. Could Canada turn to China for oil exports? Canada is the largest supplier of heavy crude oil to the United States, exporting approximately 4 million barrels per day. This has long made Canada a key player in the North American energy market. However, with the looming threat of tariffs and increased costs for US refiners, many industry experts are beginning to question whether the balance of power in oil exports is shifting. If tariffs are imposed on Canadian crude oil, the added cost could make it too expensive for US refiners to process. This would create an opening for competitors, particularly European and Asian refineries, to take advantage of Canada's energy resources. Chinese refiners eager to secure stable oil supplies would likely welcome the opportunity to purchase Canadian and Mexican oil that has become unaffordable for US buyers. This raises an important question. Could Canada sign a new oil deal with China? And if so, how would Donald Trump react? Since the completion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion in May, there has been a notable shift in Canadian oil exports. Historically, Canada was forced to export the vast majority of its oil exclusively to the US. However, the expansion of Trans Mountain has allowed Canada to send crude oil to new markets, including China and Japan. Tankers filled with Canadian crude are now passing under Vancouver's Lions Gate Bridge, heading toward refineries in the Pacific. This shift is a significant milestone for Canada's energy sector, demonstrating the country's desire to lessen its dependence on the US-Canada's strategy, expanding oil markets beyond the US. The completion of the $34 billion Trans Mountain expansion has provided Canada with an opportunity to separate itself from the volatility of US trade policies and take a bigger role in global oil markets. Many industry leaders see this as just the beginning. Adam Waterous, a former investment banker and chairman of Strathcona Resources, has suggested that the Trans Mountain Pipeline could be a stepping stone toward deeper economic ties with China. If Trump escalates his trade threats, Canada might have no choice but to turn to China as its most important energy customer. Of course, there are challenges to making this shift a reality. Canada's oil industry has long pushed for additional pipelines to expand its export capacity, but these efforts have been repeatedly stalled by opposition from environmental groups, Indigenous communities, and Canadian courts. Even the country's own federal and provincial governments have, at times, resisted these pipeline projects. However, Trump's aggressive trade policies have ignited a sense of urgency within Canada. The fear of economic instability caused by US tariffs has renewed discussions about reviving major pipeline projects. Two initiatives in particular are being considered for reactivation: Energy East and Northern Gateway. The potential revival of Energy East and Northern Gateway pipelines. The Energy East pipeline was designed to transport crude oil from Western Canada to refineries in Ontario and Quebec. If revived, it would allow Canada to export 1.1 million barrels of oil per day without having to send it through the US. This would significantly reduce Canadian dependence on US infrastructure, as Enbridge's Line 5 pipeline currently routes oil through American territory before reaching Ontario and Quebec. The Northern Gateway pipeline, which was halted in 2016 due to environmental and Indigenous opposition, was another major project that could reshape Canada's energy exports. The proposed 1,178-kilometer pipeline would have transported 525,000 barrels of oil per day from Alberta to a port in British Columbia, allowing Canada to export directly to Asian markets. If revived, this project could further accelerate Canada's shift away from the US and toward China. Some Canadian industry leaders believe the government should declare an energy emergency to expedite the approval process for these pipelines. By fast-tracking construction while Trump is still in office, Canada could reduce its vulnerability to US trade policies. However, challenges remain. Enbridge has stated that it has no plans to revive Northern Gateway and is instead focusing on expanding its existing pipelines. Similarly, TC Energy, the company originally behind Energy East, has declined to comment on any potential revival. Even if these pipeline projects were to move forward, building new infrastructure would take years and cost billions of dollars. The Trans Mountain expansion itself ended up being 6 times more expensive than its original budget, and much of the cost was covered by Canadian taxpayers after the Trudeau government stepped in to rescue the project from being abandoned. China's growing role as a buyer of Canadian oil, despite the challenges, Canada's oil exports are already making a noticeable shift toward China. The Trans Mountain expansion has led to a significant increase in Canadian crude shipments to the Chinese market. According to a study by the China Institute at the University of Alberta, China has quickly become one of the largest buyers of Canadian crude oil. In the months following the Trans Mountain expansion, early data showed that most of the increased export capacity was going to China rather than US refineries in California. This shift is particularly striking given Canada's long history of being almost entirely dependent on the US for oil sales. Between May 2024, when the expanded pipeline became operational, and November 2024, approximately $2 billion worth of Canadian crude oil was shipped to China. This accounted for nearly half of Canada's new oil exports. China is now purchasing 50% or more of the crude exported through the Trans Mountain pipeline, making it a major player in Canada's energy market. The largest Chinese buyer of Canadian oil is Rongsheng Petrochemical, which operates refineries along China's east coast, including a massive 800,000 barrel per day refinery in Zhejiang province. This growing demand from China has further reinforced Canada's motivation to diversify its energy markets and reduce its reliance on the United States. Conclusion: a new era in Canada's trade strategy. As Trump's tariff threats continue to loom over Canada, the country is actively seeking alternative markets to secure its economic future. The expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline and the potential revival of key pipeline projects like Energy East and Northern Gateway could permanently shift Canada's trade relationships. While the U.S. has historically been Canada's largest and most important trading partner, growing tensions under the Trump administration have forced Canada to explore new options. China's increasing demand for Canadian oil suggests that a major economic realignment could be underway. If this trend continues, Canada's energy sector could become less dependent on American refineries and more integrated into the global market, particularly with Asian buyers. The big question remains, how will the US respond if Canada strengthens its energy ties with China? Will Trump escalate his economic pressure on Canada, or will market forces ultimately dictate the future of North American trade? As these developments unfold, one thing is clear: Canada is no longer willing to sit back and wait for American policies to dictate its economic destiny.